The weight of winter steel. The tank destroyer sat like a dying whale beside the frozen road, its hull cracked and smoking from the direct hit that had killed its crew 3 hours earlier. Second Lieutenant Audie Murphy crouched in the tree line 30 yards away, watching German infantry probe the American positions through his binoculars. The Vosges Mountains stretched endlessly around them, snow-heavy pines creating a maze of shadows where death could hide behind any trunk. "They're massing for another push," Murphy whispered into the radio handset, his breath forming crystals in the January air. The 3rd Infantry Division had been holding these ridges for 2 weeks, trading blood for time, while higher command figured out their next move through the frozen French countryside. Captain Reynolds' voice crackled back through the static. "Hold what you've got, Murphy. Battalion says reinforcements are coming up the valley road." Murphy lowered the radio and studied the tactical situation with the cold clarity that had kept him alive through Sicily, Italy, and now this winter hell in eastern France. His company held a shallow depression in the ridge, with good fields of fire down toward the road junction. The problem was the German armor, 2 Panzer IV tanks and at least 40 infantry working their way up the slope through the scattered farmhouses. Behind him, Private Kowalski fumbled with a jammed carbine, his hands shaking either from cold or fear. The same kid who'd laughed at Murphy's patched uniform that morning now looked at him like he might have answers to questions that shouldn't exist. "Lieutenant," Sergeant Torres crawled up beside them, snow caked in his stubbled beard. "Second squad's running low on ammunition, and that tank destroyer, its main guns still intact. Engines dead, but the electrical systems might work." Murphy studied the burning vehicle. 50 yards of open ground separated their position from the road, all of it covered by German machine guns, positioned in the stone farmhouse at the base of the slope. But that tank destroyer's 76mm gun could reach the enemy armor if someone could get to it. The morning mist that had clung to the mountains earlier was lifting, and Murphy could see the German infantry moving with the confidence of men who knew they had superior numbers. Intelligence had called this sector lightly defended, but intelligence hadn't mentioned the 2 companies of mountain troops that had reinforced the position overnight. "How many rounds left in that destroyer?" Murphy asked. Torres squinted through his binoculars. "Can't tell from here, but those things usually carry 40 rounds of high explosive, enough to ruin somebody's day if you can reach the controls." A burst of machine gun fire from the farmhouse sent pine needles showering down on their position. The Germans were getting bolder, testing the American response. Murphy watched Kowalski flinch at each muzzle flash, and he remembered his own first real firefight in Sicily, the way time seemed to slow down and speed up simultaneously, the strange detachment that settled over everything like snow. Captain Reynolds materialized beside them, his field jacket torn and muddy. "Murphy, I need you to take 1st Squad and reinforce the left flank. Germans are trying to work around through the creek bed." Murphy nodded, but his eyes remained fixed on the tank destroyer. Something about the tactical picture bothered him. The way the German attack was developing, the timing of their movements. They weren't just probing for weakness. They were setting up for something bigger. "Sir," Murphy said carefully, "what if they're not trying to flank us? What if this whole attack is designed to pin us in place while their armor comes up the main road?" Reynolds followed Murphy's gaze toward the valley. In the distance, barely visible through the morning haze, dust clouds marked the movement of heavy vehicles. More German armor, probably a full company of tanks, moving to cut off the American retreat route. "Jesus," Reynolds breathed. "If you're right, we're about to be surrounded." The radio crackled with urgent traffic from other units along the ridge. 3rd Battalion reporting heavy contact. 2nd Battalion requesting immediate artillery support. The calm, professional voices couldn't quite hide the strain underneath. The sound of men realizing their positions were more desperate than anyone had planned. Murphy felt the familiar weight settling on his shoulders, the burden of decisions that would determine who walked away from this ridge and who didn't. The tank destroyer's gun pointed down the valley road like an accusation, its steel bulk offering salvation or death depending on who was brave enough or foolish enough to reach it. He thought about the letter in his breast pocket, 3 pages from his sister back in Texas about ordinary things like church socials and cotton prices. Normal life seemed as distant as the moon from this frozen ridge where young men crouched behind trees and tried not to think about the next few hours. "Lieutenant," Torres said quietly, "whatever you're thinking, I can see it in your face, and it looks crazy." Murphy almost smiled. Torres had been with him since Sicily and could read his expressions like a tactical manual. The sergeant was right. What Murphy was considering was crazy. But sometimes crazy was the only option left when all the sane choices led to disaster. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation. And stay with us for the next chapters. The German artillery began at precisely 0900 hours, walking methodically across the American positions like a giant stamping through an anthill. Murphy pressed himself against the frozen earth as 88mm rounds cracked overhead, sending shrapnel whining through the pine branches. Each explosion showered the defenders with dirt, snow, and splinters, a steady reminder that somewhere in the distance, enemy observers were adjusting fire with cold precision. "Incoming mail," Kowalski muttered, trying to burrow deeper into the rocky soil. His carbine was working again, but his hand still shook as he loaded a fresh magazine. "How long does this usually last?" "Until they think we're dead," Torres replied, checking his watch. "Then they'll send the infantry." Murphy studied the pattern of the barrage through quick glances between explosions. The Germans were concentrating their fire on the obvious defensive positions, the tree line, the rocky outcroppings where machine guns might be sighted. But they weren't hitting the road junction, which meant they planned to use it themselves once they broke through. The tank destroyer continued to smolder beside the frozen road, its armor blackened but intact. Murphy had been watching it for the past hour, noting details that might matter if his half-formed plan became their only option. The main gun was definitely operational. He could see the elevation mechanism responding to hydraulic pressure. The crew compartment was open to the sky, where the German round had penetrated, but the fighting compartment below seemed undamaged. Captain Reynolds slithered through the snow to Murphy's position, his face grim. "Just got word from battalion. Those reinforcements aren't coming. 2nd Battalion got hit by a major counterattack, and 3rd Battalion is pulling back to secondary positions. We're on our own, until tonight at the earliest." Murphy absorbed this news without surprise. In his experience, promised reinforcements existed mainly in the imagination of staff officers, safe in heated command posts. Reality was what you could see through your binoculars and what you carried in your ammunition pouches. "What are our orders, sir?" "Hold as long as possible. Then conduct an orderly withdrawal to the secondary ridge." Reynolds paused, studying Murphy's expression. "But that's going to be difficult with German armor controlling the valley road." The artillery barrage intensified, shells now falling in a precise rectangle that encompassed their entire position. Murphy felt the concussion waves hammering against his chest, and he noticed that Kowalski had stopped talking entirely, his eyes fixed on some middle distance where fear lived. Through the smoke and flying debris, Murphy caught glimpses of German infantry moving closer to the farmhouse. They advanced with the methodical patience of experienced soldiers, using every fold in the ground for cover. These weren't green replacements, they were mountain troops, specialists in exactly this kind of terrain and weather. "Sir," Murphy said, raising his voice over the shell fire, "I've been studying that tank destroyer. Its main gun could reach their armor if someone could operate it. Problem is getting there alive." Reynolds followed Murphy's gaze to the smoking vehicle. "That's 50 yards of open ground under direct machine gun fire. It's suicide." "Maybe. But if their armor gets established on that road, we're all dead anyway. At least this way, someone might make it back to tell the story." A near miss showered them with frozen clods of earth. When Murphy looked up, He saw Torres watching him with the expression of a man who'd seen this particular look before. The sergeant had been present at 3 previous actions where Murphy had decided that impossible odds simply meant someone had to try harder. "You're thinking about it again," Torres said. It wasn't a question. Murphy checked his Thompson submachine gun, counting the ammunition he carried. 4 magazines plus a bandolier of 30.06 rounds that would fit the tank destroyer's coaxial machine gun if it came to that. Not much for what he had in mind, but then again, nothing was ever enough for the kind of problem that couldn't be solved by calling for artillery support. The German barrage began to lift, shifting to targets further up the ridge. In the sudden relative quiet, Murphy could hear voices from the farmhouse, urgent commands in German as the infantry prepared for their assault. Soon they would come across that open ground in small groups, covered by machine gun fire from prepared positions, standard tactics methodically executed by men who knew their business. Murphy thought about the letter in his pocket again, but this time he remembered his sister's closing line. "Take care of yourself, little brother, because somebody has to come home and explain all this to the rest of us." The problem was that some things couldn't be explained, only lived through, and sometimes living through them required accepting odds that no sane person would accept. The tank destroyer waited beside the road like a steel promise, salvation or death, depending on who reached it first, and whether American luck could overcome German efficiency for one crucial hour. Murphy began to move his equipment into better positions for what was coming next. The kind of preparation that felt like prayer but looked like checking ammunition and adjusting helmet straps. In the Vosges Mountains, winter made everything harder. The ground was frozen, the air was thin, and metal stuck to bare skin like ice. But winter also created opportunities for men who understood that desperation could be transformed into tactical advantage if you were willing to pay the price in blood and terror. The German assault began with methodical precision at 09:30 hours, mountain infantry advancing in small groups while machine guns from the farmhouse laid down supporting fire. Murphy watched through his binoculars as they moved. Veterans who understood how to use terrain, spacing themselves properly, never presenting more than 2 or 3 targets at once. "Here they come," Torres whispered, settling behind his rifle. The American position held a dozen riflemen, 2 bars, and a 60mm mortar with 8 rounds remaining. Against 40 German infantry and armor support, it should have been no contest. Should have been. Captain Reynolds was on the radio, his voice tight with controlled urgency. "Badger 6, this is Charlie Company. Request immediate artillery support on pre-plotted target Delta 4. Enemy assault in progress. Our position about to be overrun." The radio crackled back with static and bad news. "Charlie Company, negative on artillery. Fire Direction Center took a direct hit 20 minutes ago. You're on your own until we can re-establish communications." Murphy felt the familiar cold clarity settling over his thoughts. No reinforcements, no artillery, no retreat route with German armor controlling the valley road, which meant the tank destroyer wasn't just an opportunity. It was their only chance of avoiding annihilation in the next hour. The first German squad reached the stone wall that ran parallel to the road, maybe 70 yards from the American position. Murphy could see their squad leader gesturing, coordinating the next phase of the attack. Professional soldiers doing professional work, except their work happened to involve killing him and everyone around him. "Lieutenant," Kowalski whispered, "what are we going to do?" Murphy studied the tactical situation one more time. The Germans would advance in bounds, one squad covering while another moved. Standard doctrine that would put them in the American positions within 10 minutes unless something disrupted their timing. The tank destroyer's main gun could reach their supporting weapons in the farmhouse, but only if someone could operate it under direct fire. "Torres, how good are you with tank gunnery?" The sergeant's weathered face creased into something resembling a smile. "Good enough, if you're thinking what I think you're thinking. But getting there's going to be interesting. Reynolds overheard the conversation and crawled closer. "Murphy, whatever you're planning, remember that you're needed here. The men look to you." It was true. Murphy could feel the weight of their attention, the way scared young men watched his face for signs of confidence or despair. Leadership in combat wasn't about speeches or inspiration. It was about continuing to function when every instinct screamed to run, and somehow transmitting that stubborn refusal to quit to everyone around you. But leadership also meant recognizing when conventional tactics led to certain death, and finding alternatives that might, just might, keep some of your men alive. "Sir, they're going to overrun this position in the next quarter hour. You know it, I know it, and they know it. But if someone can reach that tank destroyer and engage their armor, we might be able to disrupt their attack long enough for the rest of the company to withdraw." "Wise!" A burst of machine gun fire from the farmhouse emphasized Murphy's point, bullets snapping through the air, inches above their position. The German squad by the stone wall was preparing to move again, and Murphy could see muzzle flashes from the supporting positions. Reynolds studied Murphy's face for a long moment, reading something there that made his own expression change. "How do you want to do it?" "Covering fire on the farmhouse when I move. Torres, give me 30 seconds to reach that destroyer, then follow if you can. Everyone else, be ready to provide supporting fire once we engage their armor." Murphy began redistributing his equipment, keeping only what he'd need for the dash across open ground. Thompson's submachine gun, 4 magazines, 2 grenades, and the stubborn determination that had carried him through too many similar situations. Behind him, he could hear Kowalski breathing hard, fear and adrenaline creating their own kind of music. "Lieutenant," Torres said quietly, "you know this is crazy, right?" "Everything about this war is crazy," Murphy replied. "The trick is being crazy in the right direction." He thought about his sister's letter again, and about all the young faces watching him from foxholes and fighting positions throughout the 3rd Infantry Division. Boys from Texas and California and New York, all of them depending on someone to make the impossible choice when conventional wisdom led to disaster. The German squad leader raised his hand, preparing to signal the next phase of their attack. In a few seconds, they would move again, and the tactical window would close forever. Murphy checked his watch. 0945 hours on a frozen January morning in eastern France, when ordinary time stopped, and the kind of time that creates legends began. The tank destroyer waited beside the road like a steel altar, where courage and terror would be weighed against each other and found equal. Murphy could smell cordite in the air, mixed with pine sap and the metallic scent of snow on cold metal. Somewhere in the distance, artillery was falling on other positions, other young men facing their own impossible choices. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. Murphy moved during the next burst of covering fire, sprinting from the tree line toward the tank destroyer in a zigzag pattern that had kept him alive through a dozen similar situations. German machine gun fire converged on his route immediately, bullets cracking past his head and kicking up frozen earth around his boots. 50 yards had never seemed so far. The tank destroyer's hull loomed larger as he approached, its steel bulk offering salvation if he could reach it alive. 20 yards, 15. A burst of automatic fire stitched across the road inches behind his heels, close enough that he could feel the supersonic shock waves. Then he was diving over the side of the fighting compartment, landing hard on metal deck plates, still warm from the engine fire. The crew compartment was worse than he'd expected, twisted steel and scattered equipment where the German round had penetrated. But the gun controls were intact, hydraulic systems still functional despite the damage. Murphy had cross-trained on tank destroyers during a quiet period in Italy, enough to understand the basics of elevation, traverse, and firing sequences. Through the vision blocks, he could see the German assault developing. Two squads were advancing on the American positions, while machine guns in the farmhouse provided covering fire. Behind them, barely visible through the morning haze, German armor was moving up the valley road. Two Panzer IVs and what looked like a self-propelled gun. Murphy traversed the main gun toward the farmhouse, his hands working quickly through the loading sequence. The 76mm gun felt solid and responsive, a precision instrument designed for exactly this kind of work. Through the optical sight, he could see muzzle flashes from the German machine gun positions. The first round was high explosive, intended for fortified positions. Murphy centered the crosshairs on the farmhouse's main window, where most of the enemy fire originated, took a breath, and squeezed the firing trigger. The gun recoiled with devastating force, sending the 76mm shell across 400 yards of frozen countryside in less than 2 seconds. The farmhouse erupted in smoke and debris, stone walls collapsing inward as the high explosive round detonated in the confined space. The German machine gun fire ceased abruptly. Murphy was already loading the second round when rifle fire began impacting on the tank destroyer's hull, metallic ringing sounds as German infantry tried to suppress his position. But steel armor had advantages over foxholes, and Murphy continued his methodical work with the main gun. The second round targeted the stone wall where German infantry had taken cover. Another direct hit, sending bodies and equipment flying through the winter air. The German assault wavered, then began to fall back as their supporting fire disappeared and their casualties mounted. Through the periscope, Murphy could see Torres sprinting toward the tank destroyer, the sergeant's rifle ready as he provided his own covering fire. German snipers were trying to pick him off, but Torres moved with the fluid grace of an experienced soldier who understood the mathematics of survival under fire. "Room for one more?" Torres gasped as he tumbled into the fighting compartment. "Take the Koch's machine gun," Murphy replied, already traversing the main gun toward new targets. German armor coming up the valley road, maybe 800 yards. The Panzer IVs appeared through the morning mist like steel predators, their own guns seeking targets among the American positions. Murphy could see their commanders in the open turret hatches, directing their drivers toward optimal firing positions. Professional tank crews who understood their business and expected to survive the morning. Murphy's third round was armor-piercing, designed to penetrate the frontal armor of medium tanks at normal combat ranges. He led the 1st Panzer slightly, accounting for its movement across the slope, and fired when the range closed to 600 yards. The AP round struck the German tank's turret at the junction between gun mantlet and armor face. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen. Then smoke began pouring from the commander's hatch, and Murphy could see crew members bailing out of the disabled vehicle. The 2nd Panzer IV had identified the tank destroyer as a threat and was traversing its gun toward Murphy's position. This was the crucial moment. Who could fire first in a duel between armor-piercing rounds and steel plate? Murphy loaded another AP round with mechanical precision, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. The German gun fired first, its muzzle flash brilliant in the grey morning light. The round missed by inches, passing through the space where the tank destroyer's turret would have been if it had possessed one. Murphy's return shot struck the Panzer's hull just below the driver's vision port, penetrating the armor and causing a secondary explosion that sent the German tank's turret flying 20 feet through the air. Torres was working the coaxial machine gun with deadly efficiency, engaging German infantry who were trying to advance on the tank destroyer's position. "More armor coming up the road," he shouted over the sound of gunfire. "Looks like a self-propelled gun, maybe a Jagdpanzer." Murphy could see it through the gun sight, a low, angular silhouette mounting a 75mm gun in a fixed casemate. Heavier armor than the Panzer IVs, and a crew that had just witnessed the destruction of their supporting tanks. This would be more difficult. The self-propelled gun fired from maximum range, its rounds striking the road surface just short of the tank destroyer and sending up a shower of asphalt and stone fragments. Good shooting, but not quite good enough. Murphy adjusted his aim point and fired his fifth round of the engagement. The armor-piercing shell struck the German vehicle's glacis plate and ricocheted skyward, leaving only a bright scar on the steel surface. Too much armor at too great a range? Murphy would need to wait for a closer shot or find a more vulnerable target area. The German self-propelled gun began advancing methodically up the valley road, its commander understanding that he needed to close the range to ensure penetration of the tank destroyer's armor. Murphy watched through the optical sight as the angular vehicle approached, looking for the perfect shot that would end the engagement before enemy persistence overcame American ammunition. But something was wrong with the tank destroyer's hydraulic systems. The main gun was becoming sluggish to traverse, and Murphy could smell burning oil in the fighting compartment. The German round that had killed the original crew had done more damage than initially apparent, and the vehicle's mechanical systems were slowly failing under combat stress. "Torres, how many rounds do we have left?" The sergeant checked the ammunition storage. 6 rounds of AP, maybe a dozen high explosive, but I'm seeing fluid leaks back here. Hydraulics are dying. Murphy felt the familiar weight of impossible decisions settling on his shoulders. The tank destroyer was becoming a stationary target, its mobility already gone and its gun systems failing. Soon it would be nothing more than a steel coffin for anyone trapped inside. But the German armor had to be stopped, or the entire American position would be overrun in the next hour. Through the periscope, he could see Captain Reynolds coordinating the withdrawal of the remaining riflemen to secondary positions. Good, at least some of his men would live to fight another day. But someone had to continue engaging the German armor until the withdrawal was complete, even if it meant staying in a vehicle that was slowly dying around them. The Jagdpanzer fired again, this round striking the tank destroyer's sloped front armor and penetrating into the engine compartment. Murphy felt the impact like a physical blow, and he could see flames beginning to spread through the mechanical spaces behind them. The tank destroyer was burning, its ammunition storage now at risk of catastrophic explosion. "We need to go," Torres said urgently. "This thing's going to cook off." Murphy lined up his 6th shot, the crosshair centered on the German vehicle's driver's vision port. At 400 yards, the armor-piercing round should penetrate the casemate's frontal protection and disable the crew. One more shot, maybe 2, if the hydraulics held together long enough. He fired. The AP round struck exactly where intended, penetrating the German armor and causing immediate secondary explosions inside the fighting compartment. The Jagdpanzer slewed sideways and came to rest against a stone wall, smoke pouring from its hatches. But the tank destroyer was dying around them. Murphy could feel the deck plates becoming hot beneath his feet, and the smell of burning ammunition propellant filled the air. They had perhaps 30 seconds before the vehicle's ammunition storage reached ignition temperature and turned their refuge into a crematorium. "Now we go," Murphy said, grabbing his Thompson and preparing to abandon the position that had saved his company, but would shortly become his tomb. Torres was already moving, gathering his rifle and the spare ammunition they'd need for the withdrawal to secondary positions. "Hell of a thing, Lieutenant. Think it'll make the after-action reports?" Murphy almost smiled as he followed Torres out of the burning tank destroyer. Probably just a line about engaging enemy armor with available weapons. You know how these things get written up. They sprinted toward the tree line, where the surviving members of Charlie Company were establishing a new defensive line. Behind them, the tank destroyer burned with increasing intensity, its ammunition finally reaching critical temperature. The explosion, when it came, shattered windows in the abandoned farmhouse and sent a pillar of black smoke rising into the grey January sky. Captain Reynolds was waiting for them at the secondary position, his face showing relief mixed with professional assessment of their tactical situation. "Good work, Murphy. You bought us the time we needed for an orderly withdrawal." Casualties are lighter than expected. Maybe we'll all live to see dinner tonight." Murphy nodded, but he was thinking about the young German tank crews he'd killed in the past hour. Boys from Bavaria or Prussia, probably, following orders and doing their duty until armor-piercing rounds ended their participation in the war. The mathematics of survival always involved someone else's death, an equation that became heavier each time you solved it successfully. Private Kowalski approached hesitantly, his carbine now functioning properly and his hands steadier than they'd been that morning. "Lieutenant, I wanted to thank you for what you did back there. We all would have died if you hadn't reached that gun." "Maybe," Murphy replied, "or maybe someone else would have thought of something different. War's got more variables than anyone can calculate." But he knew that wasn't entirely true. In his experience, crucial moments usually came down to individual decisions made by scared young men who discovered reserves of courage they didn't know they possessed. The after-action reports would reduce today's events to tactical summaries and casualty figures, but the reality was more complex, fear and determination existing simultaneously, heroes created by circumstances no one would choose voluntarily. The withdrawal continued through the afternoon, American forces establishing new positions on more defensible terrain, while German units probed for weakness in the revised defensive line. By evening, the battle for this particular ridge would be recorded in division logs as a successful delaying action with acceptable losses. Murphy would receive another citation for his actions with the tank destroyer, words on paper that attempted to transform private terror and mechanical competence into something larger than the sum of their parts. But late at night, when the official version faded into memory, he would remember the sound of burning hydraulic fluid and the faces of enemy tank crews who died because he was faster with an armor-piercing round. The medal ceremony took place 3 weeks later in a commandeered schoolhouse 50 miles behind the front lines, complete with a regimental band that played off-key in the cold air. Murphy stood at attention while a colonel from division headquarters read the citation aloud, transforming his desperate fight with a burning tank destroyer into clean military prose about conspicuous gallantry and devotion to duty beyond the call. The official language bore little resemblance to what Murphy remembered: the smell of cordite and burning oil, the way his hands had shaken as he loaded armor-piercing rounds, the mathematical precision required to kill enemy tank crews before they killed him. But he'd learned that citations served different purposes than memories, creating stories that could be shared with families back home who needed heroes more than they needed complicated truths. Captain Reynolds pinned the Bronze Star to Murphy's field jacket, the same patched uniform that had drawn laughter from replacement soldiers who were now either dead or wise enough to understand that appearances meant nothing when measured against performance under fire. "Hell of a thing, Murphy," Reynolds said quietly. "Company owes you more than a piece of ribbon can express." Udreich after the ceremony, Murphy found himself walking alone through the village streets, his new medal heavy in his breast pocket beside his sister's letter. The cobblestones were slick with January ice, and smoke rose from chimneys where French civilians tried to stay warm in houses damaged by months of artillery fire. War had its own geography, creating landscapes where normal life continued in the spaces between military necessity. Torres caught up with him near the village church, the sergeant moving with the careful gait of someone whose back had been strained by too many hours in cramped tank compartments. "Funny thing about citations," Torres observed. "They never mention how scared you were, or how the equipment kept breaking down, or how you mostly just tried not to get everyone killed." "Maybe that's for the best," Murphy replied. "People need stories they can understand, not memories they can't forget." They walked in comfortable silence for a while, two soldiers who had shared an hour of controlled terror and lived to discuss its aftermath. Around them, the 3rd Infantry Division was preparing for whatever operation would follow their current defensive positions, the endless cycle of advance and consolidation that characterized combat in the Vosges Mountains during the winter of 1945. "You ever think about after?" Torres asked. "When this whole thing's over and we're back home trying to explain to people what it was like." Murphy considered the question carefully. He'd been thinking about after more frequently as his collection of combat decorations grew and his survival became increasingly statistical, improbable. What would he tell his sister about the morning he'd fought German armor from a burning tank destroyer? How could he describe the weight of decisions made in seconds that determined who lived and who died? "I think mostly we won't talk about it," he said finally. "People will ask, but they'll want the clean version, the one that makes sense and has heroes and villains and clear victories. The messy parts will stay with us." Yeah. A jeep convoy passed through the village, carrying supplies toward the front lines, where other young men were discovering their own capacity for courage and terror. Murphy watched the vehicles disappear around a curve in the road, thinking about the continuous nature of war. How individual actions became part of larger operations, which became part of campaigns, which became part of the historical narrative that would survive long after the participants were dead. 20 years later, Murphy would be living in California, working in the film industry, and trying to build a normal life around memories that refused to stay buried. Sometimes the smell of diesel fuel would transport him instantly back to that burning tank destroyer, and he would remember the precise sequence of loading and firing that had kept his company alive for one crucial hour. The nightmares would come irregularly but persistently, not dramatic dreams of explosion and gunfire, but quiet, detailed recreations of the mechanical process of killing enemy tank crews, loading, aiming, firing, the mathematical precision required to transform young Germans into casualties, repeated with the methodical efficiency that combat demanded. His wife would learn not to wake him during these episodes, understanding that some experiences existed in spaces beyond the reach of comfort or explanation. The bronze star would remain in a drawer, occasionally examined but never displayed, a piece of metal that represented one morning when ordinary fear had been temporarily overcome by stubborn determination. The official version of Murphy's War would grow larger over time, accumulating details and significance that bore only passing resemblance to the scared young man who had improvised his way through impossible situations. But the real weight would remain private, carried in the quiet moments when memory insisted on accuracy over legend. In the village church, an elderly priest was conducting evening services for a congregation of French civilians whose lives had been disrupted by the collision between American advance and German withdrawal. Their prayers rose through candlelit air, seeking meaning in circumstances that tested faith more severely than peacetime doubts ever could. Murphy paused at the church entrance, listening to voices raised in ancient words that transcended nationality and military necessity. For a moment, the war seemed very far away, reduced to background noise by the simple act of people gathering to acknowledge forces beyond their immediate control. But only for a moment. Artillery was falling somewhere to the east, distant thunder that reminded everyone within hearing that the business of killing continued regardless of prayer or decoration ceremonies or the human need for stories that made sense of senseless events. Murphy and Torres resumed their walk through the village, two survivors of an engagement that would be recorded in division histories as a minor tactical success. Behind them, the church bells rang the hour, marking time in a world where young men discovered that heroism was mostly a matter of continuing to function, when everything around you suggested that giving up would be the reasonable response. The medal in Murphy's pocket would outlast the man who earned it, becoming part of a collection that museums would display to explain courage to visitors who had never heard machine gun fire or smelled burning tank destroyers. But the real story would remain with the survivors, carried in silence through lives that had been shaped by one winter morning when ordinary fear met extraordinary necessity and somehow found a balance that kept other people alive. If this story reminded you that behind every medal there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.